Hi, guys, and welcome to episode 3 of Moments in Time, season 3, operations in Norway and Narvik. And we've kind of killed Alina with far too much naval history, so it's just me and Zane this week, isn't it, mate?
It is. Apparently, it was just too much for her, and she needs a little bit of time to recover. So, hopefully, she gets to feeling better with regurgitating naval history, but, we'll see.
Yeah, I mean, I think she'll be relieved later on in the series when we move more to the ground fighting. But before we get to that, there is still some more naval work to go. And as you remember from the last episode, the Germans sending in warships to certain areas to drop off soldiers and to then provide artillery support. And one of them is the light cruiser Konigsberg. They've landed, but they got damaged by sort of coastal artillery as they were going in. Nothing major, but enough to sort of knock her out for a little bit and doing sort of some patch jobs to repair her. They're also trying to carry out this sort of artillery support, but Admiral Raider is also worried about the status of his ships. Something we're going to probably talk about in our Patreon episode. If you want to hear that, do feel free to sign up. About how sort of this overall operation does really dent the German Navy, because they're not that big to start with, as the war started 5 years too early for them. But obviously, having a stationary warship in a port, the RAF think, right, this is our time to strike, to see if we can get rid of them, take them off the board. And so on the first night, 115 Squadron and 9 Squadron send out aircraft to try and find it, but only 6 find it. They're sort of dropping semi-armor piercing bombs, which should be quite good, damaging it, but they only cause really minor damage. There's a follow-up raid chalked up for the 10th of April, but it's scrubbed because the weather's bad. But where the RAF fail, the Royal Navy decide that they need to step up. And so the Fleet Air Arms, they've got these dive bombers called Blackburn Skewers. They get a lot of bad press, much like the Ferry Battle, for being flying coffins, mainly because they get sent into areas where they don't have fighter superiority, and so are easily sort of shot down in the same way that the Stuka suffers sort of later in the war. The only real downside in their design is that the fuel tank's right inside the rear gunner's turret. So if you hit the rear turret, you can set the whole thing on fire. Anyway, the German commander, Kapitan Heinrich Rufus, is preparing to leave on the 10th of April. Unbeknownst to the British, they've got a very, very small window in which to attack. The big problem that the Fleet Air Arm face is they're not launching from anywhere near to where the Konigsberg is. They're up in the Orkney Islands, and it's a long journey. 800 and 803 Squadron, who are going to be carrying out, their skewers have only got a range of 760 miles. But if you add on the fuel, and it's a round trip of 660 miles, it sounds like 100 miles is they've got 100 miles to play with, and that should be fair, quite a bit. But that also includes the aircraft taxiing, flying around until you can get to your rendezvous point, and then you've got to be so precise with your navigation, it might make coming home a little bit dicey. So at 3:30 a.m., the pilots of all 16 aircraft meet for briefing, and then they're going to have breakfast at 4. Bad weather pushes the launch time back to 5:15, and they have to go up to 12,000 feet. Once they take off, they go up to 12,000 feet, go to radio silence, and then move off towards Marston in Norway. At 7 a.m., the skewers arrive over Norway and then start to approach Bergen, where Königsberg is anchored. But they're going to approach from the southeast and attack in 2 waves. Germans aren't really ready for any air raids. They've had an alert at 6:30 a.m. when the RAF send a reconnaissance aircraft over, and they think, "Oh God, here comes another raid." Everything goes to red alert. Everyone's manning the guns. The Luftwaffe liaison officer on board the Königsberg tells them that the British it should be fine. Everyone goes back to sort of standby, and then the skewers approach. Again, the Luftwaffe liaison officer looks up and goes, "No, don't worry. The British don't have any single-engine dive bombers. You'll be fine. They're probably just they're ours." And that's when the air raid starts. So at 7:18, the skewers begin their attack, sort of diving down and releasing their bombs at 2,000 feet to give them the best chance for the SAP, the semi-armor piercing bombs, to break the hull. If you drop from a high height, the velocity makes the bomb more likely to pierce the armor. If you drop at a low height, they're just going to bounce off. They won't have achieved full penetration. The first 8 skewers drop without any flak at all and soon pull off. Obviously, the Germans realise what's going on, and everyone starts manning the machine guns and anti-aircraft guns, and also firing off any small arms. First strikes start fire aboard. Another one of the bombs actually does penetrate to go through to the engine room and blows a hole in the hull. After the first two waves attack, Lieutenant Taylor arrived 10 minutes late. He'd been separated from the formation at the beginning and had so made his way to Bergen completely on his own, and so attacks 10 minutes after everyone else has gone. Boiler Room 4 is flooded. Boiler Room 3 is heavily splintered and flooding. Boiler Room 2 had to be abandoned, and as was Boiler Room 1. There's no steam. They can't use the pumps to fight the flooding because without steam you can't have electricity. You can't generate electricity. So she's dead on the water. She's not going anywhere. The engines are damaged. As I said, there's no fire. There's no power. All they've got is handheld fire extinguishers to put out the deck fires, which are just getting worse and worse and worse. The sick bay has to be abandoned, and the medics are running around on deck trying to treat 24 wounded, and there's also 18 dead. With the ship massively on fire, and everyone exceptionally worried that the fire is reaching the torpedo magazine, which caused the whole ship to explode, everyone abandons ship, and she capsizes at the dock at 9:51 in the morning. Only one skewer is lost, and that is Lieutenant Smeaton and his gunner, Midshipman Watkinson. They were killed as the formation is pulling out. Smeaton's skewer just dives vertically straight into the fjord at 1,000 feet, and both men were killed. Later that day, the rest of the skewers arrive. 15 skewers arrive in drips and drabs, but they all managed to land quite safely in the Orkneys, having pulled off a really quite successful air raid that cost the Germans a light cruiser. And we have Captain A.V.S. Yates, who was one of the officers at the Orkneys, and this is his testimony about their return.
What a day! I awoke at 04:30 to the roaring of the Stukas as 16 of them took off from Bergen, and I was on the aerodrome to welcome them as 15 out of 16 returned soon after 9. Brave gang in old aircraft, which cannot catch a modern bomber, let alone escape from a fighter, they all attacked the one German cruiser in Bergen. The estimated 3, if not 4 hits, and of course hits on the jetty alongside, may well have been effective. Anxiously, we counted as they came back, most in perfect formation. 2 with crumpled wings, the last one very groggy, banking wildly as he came into land, and having to make a second shot at it. No heroics, no press photographs here, as in the RAF. They fell outside headquarters, and as they were dismissed, I heard one sailor chuckle to another. "What do we do now, mate? Bomb up again?" "Shouldn't be surprised," came the answer. As they walked away, little Dick Bal Davis, their admiral with the VC ribbon on his breast, said, "Well done," to one or two of them. That was it.
Well, that was a really good testimony from Captain Yates. Speaking of, we were talking about the stewards with the Luftwaffe. Now we could probably talk a little bit more about both situations, particularly the RAF. Now, prior to the invasion of Norway, the British, of course, as we've hinted at it a little bit, I believe we did in the context episode, where we were talking about that the British are obviously planning for operations in Norway, and the RAF originally had planned to dispatch aircraft, but as I guess one could say is typical of the RAF, and you can correct me if I'm wrong here, Chris, that they're going to do it in a pretty gradual fashion. They have to have 2 bomber squadrons and 1 army cooperation squadron, and then they're going to have 3 additional fighter squadrons. And of course, the Navy is assured that or at least they assured the air staff anyway, that it would take time to conquer Scandinavia.
Because, I mean, unlike the Germans, the RAF they're more invested in France, which
Sure, rightly so.
Yeah, I mean the Luftwaffe are going straight in, and they just start seizing airfields, which is what if the RAF are going to go to Norway and send aircraft, they're going to need air bases. But obviousstly, the first target the Germans have, I mean, with any blitzkrieg, wherever they go, they always strike the airfields first. But in this case, they take Stavanger with paratroopers on day 1, so that they know they can build an air bridge. and this is immediately starting to rob airfields from any possible British incursion.
Which essentially one could say is puts the RAF on their heels, because it's like, we were planning on using that, and now we have to find out about temporary airfields, at least in some capacity. But there's also the medium bombers, right? You've got the Wellingtons, the Whitleys, Hamptons, and they'd have to operate from Britain and across the North Sea. Hurricane fighters, they're just not going to have the range to get across the North Sea. So any fighter operations, it's going to have to be carried out by 2-engine Blenheim fighters, which also means that any landings in Norway, they're going to have no fighter support or protection from German bomber attacks. And I can't help but think of, it's not quite a good idea given what just happened, either just happened or is about to happen. I'm getting my timeline mixed up, regarding Dunkirk.
Well, yeah. I mean, the Blenheim is because it's a medium bomber that's converted to a fighter, and as anyone who knows anything about the Battle of Britain with the 2-engine Messerschmitt 110, it's outclassed by single-engine fighters, by the Spitfires and the Hurricanes. Well, we're getting the same thing over Norway. If a Blenheim fighter gets involved, they're not quite fast enough to keep up with German bombers. They're certainly not fast enough to keep up with 109s. And in a dogfight with a 109, a Blenheim 1 fighter is screwed, for want of a better word. But as I was saying, the RAF have also got this big problem that all of their they've built up a strike force of light bombers, like the Fairey Battles and Blenheim Mark 1s and 4 bombers, but they're all in France. You know, they're ready for the German invasion of France, and if maybe Holland and Belgium, if the Germans decide to go that way. Bomber Command isn't the Bomber Command that you have sort of destroying German cities in 1944 going into 1945. They've only got 23 bomber squadrons available, whereas the Luftwaffe have got 110 to 120.
Now, can you remind me again, just for my own sanity, the size of the squadron? How many aircraft are in a squadron?
Roughly between 12 and 16 aircraft.
Between 12 and 16. So yeah, that's an overwhelming majority in the Luftwaffe's side, at least early in this stage.
Yeah. I mean, mainly because in the 1930s, their patron being Hermann Goering, being second in command to Hitler in the Third Reich hierarchy, means that he could get as much investment as he wanted. And you kind of have the 1920s theories of Douai that you could win a war with just the Air Force, and Goering's a big fan of this, flatten cities and they'll surrender. Like in the Context episode, or with the Danish one, where they said, if you don't surrender Denmark, we will flatten Copenhagen. And the Danish king's like, don't want to risk that. And if they're producing 100, the Germans are fielding 120 squadrons of aircraft, it's what can you do against that?
It's true. I mean, those numbers do, I guess, provide support, if you will, for Goering's argument that we could just win it with the Luftwaffe. At least at this point. Later on, not so much, but at least right now, that could be a pretty good argument to make given the numbers.
Yeah, and they're sitting on their bases. Our guys have got to fly across the North Sea, so they're going to be looking at the fuel tanks the whole time. They've got to, especially for the Blenheim fighters, it's like we're going to have to go back in a minute because it's a long journey back to Norfolk. Whereas the Germans are.
Now, are they going to have?
Yeah.
Sorry, I hate to interrupt, but I just had a question. Is that concept you were just talking about? They're going to have to pay attention to their fuel. Are they running into a similar situation as the SCUAs?
Yeah, pretty much.
Is it similar, or is it worse, or is it better?
It's slightly better because the Blenheim can carry more fuel than a SCUA.
Okay.
SCUAs being single-engined, they can there are a lot smaller aircraft, so they can only carry a much smaller amount of fuel. But even still, for a Blenheim flying from Norfolk to Norway, if you come down over the North Sea, you're not necessarily going to be picked up. So you don't want to ditch in the North Sea. I mean, it's bad enough in the Battle of Britain if you ditch in the Channel. There's 22 miles between us and Calais, between sort of Kent and Calais.
That's true. Yes.
If you come down in the North Sea, it's a long way to between Norway and Norfolk, where the Blenheims are based. So you've got to be paying attention to your fuel gauge just so you've got enough to get back. So it's kind of similar, but it's not quite as dire as it would be for the SCUAs. But also at this point, the Germans have managed to base about 200 aircraft in Norway and Denmark, and this is all by like the 10th and the 11th of April.
So they've done it pretty quickly then.
Yeah. I think they kind of they by this point they've already realised with the successful campaign in Poland that air support is the key to winning battles in the Second World War. You know, in the First World War, it's kind of a novelty. By the Second World War, this is how we're going to win: flying artillery. But we've got an example air raid written about the 11th of April. 115 Squadron's Wellington bombers. At the time, they're called heavy bombers, but by the end of the war, they're kind of medium bombers. But they're twin-engined. They're really good actually. They've got quite a fair amount of firepower on them, and they've got the geodesic designed by Barnes Wallis, which means they can absorb a lot of damage. If anyone's interested, if you Google Wellington's flak damage, there are photographs of Wellingtons that really should not have made it back from Germany with like big holes in them, but then the fuselage holding together. It's amazing.
Oh, wow.
But these guys are being chalked up to raid Stavanger airfield, which, as I said, is kind of like the key one for the RAF, for the German Air Force. They're a bit muddled. Well, they're so muddled, in fact, that by the time that 115 Squadron are ready to go, they've been moved up to a Coastal Command airfield. But they haven't got any trolleys to move the bombs from the magazine to the aircraft. So they're just kind of they're reacting to this invasion rather than being proactive. They are lagging quite a bit. Anyway, they get to the briefing, and one of the pilots puts his hand up and said, "You've told us that if we are sort of engaged by one fighter, that we should evade it. What happens if we meet four?" And the intelligence officer said, "No, that's most unlikely."
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Yes, they have two Blenheims that are going to fly fighter escort. They're going to arrive at the airfield at sort of quarter to 8 in the evening, and then fly around, keep the bombers off while they're dropping the bombs, and then leave about 9 o'clock. But the Blenheims get there early.
Oh, boy.
They also find that the Germans are already on red alert, because the same thing that with the Konigsberg, a reconnaissance aircraft's gone over and taken pictures and said, "Oh yeah, this is what's going to happen." So the Luftwaffe are like, right, something's coming, and so they're all on complete standby. So the Blenheims fly around and decide to machine gun the airfield. So they come in low, they do like 3 or 4 passes of this airfield machine gunning it, and then fly off. There's a bit of confusion over the radio as to where they are and what they're doing, but basically they leave, and then the Wellingtons turn up, and they've been delayed as well, which doesn't help. And they come under blistering flak ground fire. And although they do drop some bombs, Pilot Officer Barker's bomber gets shot down, and it crashes in flames and hits a school, killing 2 civilians on the ground, and the entire crew are killed and buried. One of my friends and former politics colleagues, his uncle was aboard, Sergeant Jeff Juby, of which my friend Jeff is named. But yeah, he was killed, and the whole crew are buried in near Stavanger.
Oh, wow. Well, it's interesting that you mention the fact that there's confusion as to where they are and where they're attacking, because isn't it the following morning that a spotter plane realizes there's been no damage to the airfield?
Yeah, they completely miss it. I mean, there's one Dornier 17 bomber that's been destroyed on the ground. That's it. RAF accuracy. Well, yeah, RAF accuracy at this point is really not good, which is why sort of later on they go to area bombing, because we'll just drop it roughly in the area. But yeah, but to be fair, they were also under quite heavy anti-aircraft fire. These guys have done a lot of training. They haven't necessarily done a lot of active flying. So, they're still sort of kind of new to this and being fired at. It's also amazing that they made it, because navigation is not anyone's strong suit. Even more so when you're flying across the North Sea, because it's lots and lots of vast open space. There's no landmarks to go, "Oh, this is where we are." And so they're using a lot of dead reckoning. If you fly east at this speed, we should hit here. So it's kind of a miracle they actually made it. And the most useful thing that the RAF are doing at the moment is laying mines in German ports and sea lanes.
Well, that's interesting, because the Luftwaffe, in comparison, is believing, and I mean correctly, I would state that their biggest problem, of course, is going to be the Royal Navy, and so they had dispatched the Flieger Corps 10, who had a lot of the anti-shipping experts amongst their formations, It would be reinforced by 21 squadrons of fighters, bombers, Stukas, and heavy fighters, which would bring the Corps up to 48 squadrons or 527 aircraft, of which 317 would be bombers.
Yeah, I mean that's quite a force, isn't it?
That's pretty significant.
Yes, yeah. Just going off the top, just thinking. I mean, the Battle of Britain, we had 600 aircraft. I think the RAF had 600 aircraft, and that's all of Fighter Command, and a very similar. And at the same time, Fliegerkorps 10 has got the same amount of aircraft just for invading Norway.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting thing to point out of just like the scale, the lopsidedness and the scale that is happening right now. I think is for some people, I think that it's hard to understand just like how drastically different what we consider, whether it's the British, whether it's even the French and the Germans, the difference that it is at the beginning stages of the war and how that changes, of course, by 1944, 1945 with everything else. But it really is. And I think it also points to being significant for why the Battle of Britain is so successful and it's meaningful and impactful is because I mean, like we were just pointing out, the entire coastal command the entirety of it is just a group of squadrons that's put together in this corps to invade Norway. I was about to say Normandy, but Norway.
Yeah, it's a bit later. So yeah, they're not just being used to support the German army, which is interesting in itself because when you get to later in the war, the German army just become obsessed with the Luftwaffe having to constantly be there to support them. They're also supporting the German Navy and trying to screen them from not just RAF attacks, but also the Royal Navy, which, as we said, they're also being reserved for possible terror raids on Oslo and Copenhagen to try and break the morale of the public, in the hope that if they can cause enough terror, then the people will surrender, or the government will be forced to surrender. They're also trying to provide an air bridge over the Baltic because ships are vulnerable, but you could fly in a force of Junker 52 transports and just straight into Stavanger, more men, more ammunition, more food. Can't move bigger guns and tanks, but you can move a lot of the lighter logistical stuff. And I think they bring in 2,000 soldiers, which is 18% of the entire German task force by this air bridge, which is quite impressive, really. And they also go on to capture more bases around Oslo, where they can. It gives them hangars, it gives them spare parts, ammunition if they can use it, fuel, and the Germans are very
all the important things.
Oh yeah. The Germans are very good at sort of capturing and then utilizing other people's stuff, which is a discussion for a whole other day. They also capture bases where they can use their float planes, such as Heinkel 115 torpedo bombers around Trondheim, whereas the RAF just seem to have to sit on their bases back in Norfolk and England and watch what's going on.
Well, I mean, when you're not able to get the very same bases that they're able to capture, that you're needing and you're going to need the airfields for, because again, you're looking and dealing with issues of how far can you go because of how many nautical miles can you get before you have to turn around and refuel and everything else. So of course it becomes a pretty significant issue. And if our listeners have been listening to our previous episodes, they realize that this is April 13th. So at this point, I know we've talked about it before in an interesting way. We've said that there would be more than one Battle of Narvik, and we are up to the third Battle of Narvik, I believe.
Yeah. This is the third and final naval battle, and last one we had, the Royal Navy were going in kind of a cavalry charge, weren't they? Of a group of destroyers going in, causing havoc.
Yes, it seems very much so. Yes, I would agree with that.
Yeah. This one is the other thing the Royal Navy do well: unrelenting force. And Admiral William Whitworth leads a task force in, and he's brought possibly the most famous British battleship ever, the unstoppable HMS Warspite, with 9 destroyers and the aircraft carrier HMS Furious. So the British are now, I mean, we've got 7 destroyers left after the second Battle of Narvik. And now the British are sending in a dreadnought that had been at the Battle of Jutland to completely obliterate the force that are there. As we know from the last battle, the commander of the German force, Commandant Bonti, has died. So commanders passed the Fregatten-Kapitan Erich Bay. He's down to 8 destroyers. They've got little to no fuel, and they've depleted a large amount of their ammunition. Warspite launches a float plane, a ferry swordfish float plane, to go and have a look to see what's going on in front of them. And that and the destroyers report that the Germans are kind of scattered around. What they don't notice is the submarine U-64 in Fjord near Bjervik until it comes to the surface. And we have another first. This is the first U-boat to be sunk by an aircraft in World War II, as the float plane comes and drops a bomb on it.
So where does that put us now? Does that put us at 3 or 4 firsts?
Oh, God, I don't know. Well, including the ones with the albatross from the Patreon.
Yeah.
Probably about 4, 5, possibly.
Okay.
Because she was the first ship to open fire. Then we had the first paratroop drop.
Right.
First bombing by an aircraft, a battleship launched aircraft.
That's 3.
The U-boat sunk. First
4.
U-boat sunk.
So we're up to 4.
Yeah, at least. Oh, I'm trying to think. There must be more.
Oh well, you know.
I can't remember now. So you've also got the U-46 that attempts a torpedo run on Warspite, but whilst moving to attack, it hits an underwater ridge and is forced to surface and then withdraw. The destroyer Erich Kolner is the first to spot the British aircraft, along with the Hermann Kuhn, and they went to Tarstad. And a short while later, they saw the British destroyers coming in. So they're pretty sure that, the end is coming. Under fire from the British, the Hermann Kuhn begins to zigzag away at high speed, whilst the Kölner moves to the southern side of the fjord to try and ambush the British as they go past. But when it came to firing torpedoes, they either missed or malfunctioned. The destroyers Bedouin, Punjabi, and Eskimo opened fire on the Kölner. But it was Warspite's guns, huge guns, that just absolutely pummel and sink the Kölner, killing 31 and wounding 35. And the survivors are captured by Norwegians when they wade ashore.
Speaking of the Hermann Kuhn, it's continuing, it seems, in its zigzagging as it's heading towards Narvik. And part of the zigzag is because it's attempting to lay smoke, not just to protect itself, but more importantly, the destroyers that happen to be exiting Narvik harbor. And only the Hans Ludemann, Wolfgang Zenker, and Bern von Arnim were able to put to sea. The George Still and Eric Guys, they're unable, however, to leave the port. Now, the Germans are approached abreast and they are open fire upon at 17,000 meters. And they would try to get close for torpedoes, but Warspite's guns would force them to break away. The British destroyers are pretty inaccurate, as is the case with the aircraft from the Furious. But the Germans were withdrawing from the battle towards Narvik after an hour due to an issue of the all-important running out of ammunition. Because, at that point, you really can't throw anything at somebody because they're just going to be too far away. So you're going to have ammunition in order to make that work for you. But again, the Hermann Kuhn moved into Hergensford and would scuttle itself after firing the last of their ammunition. So the Eric Guys would leave Narvik and it would move into Rombak Fjord, where it came under heavy fire from about 6 destroyers. And this, of course, would start uncontrollable fires. And even while it was able to manage to put a torpedo into the Punjabi, it was, of course, doomed. Her commander would order her abandoned, and the ship would be sunk at 2:30 in the afternoon. Warspite and several other destroyers would approach the pier in Narvik, where the Dieter von Roeder was tied up due to engine issues. The Germans, of course, would fire at the incoming ships until also running out of ammunition, when damaging the Cossack and forcing her to beach before scuttling themselves. The Wolfgang Zenkler and Berd von Arnim would move to Rombak's Bottom. My apologies to our Norwegian listeners for butchering that name. And would scuttle themselves to stop them from being taken over by the British. all the while under cover from the George Seal and Hans Ludemann. Now, the British destroyers would follow the 4 German destroyers, and the Hans Ludemann would soon as well run out of ammunition and have to scuttle itself too. If our listeners haven't figured it out yet, there seems to be a running theme here of shoot until you run out of ammunition and then scuttle. Only the George Steele would remain. The Eskimo, of course, is sunk by one of the Thiel's torpedoes, which rips off the forecastles, killing 15 English sailors. The ship then would reverse, causing the other British ships to chaotically move around her. Because I'm assuming that would be a very abrupt thing to do, and at least at this point in time, I would imagine, can't really turn on a dime in these ships. So
No, especially not in the fjords where there's not much room to maneuver because you've got like either side of you just got mountains and land heading upwards. Yeah, you don't have loads of space. It's like trying to do a 3-point turn in a country lane rather than in a car park. If you've got a car park, you've got loads of space to turn your car wherever. In a fjord where you've got like the land either side shooting up in either direction, it's like trying to turn in. Do a 3-point turn in a country lane. We have Commander Fitzroy of the Royal Navy giving his version of events.
As we passed into the Narrows at the end of the long fjord, I remember thinking it was like a forward rush in Rugger. We belted along at high speed, with the destroyers doing magnificent work ahead of us. The roar of our 15-inch guns reverberated from the steep, snow-covered sides of the fjord, but the explosions of the enemy torpedoes when they hit the rocks were even greater. Fortunately, the enemy was prevented from firing across our track, and all the torpedoes ran parallel to us and missed. Tall columns of smoke soon marked the positions where the big German destroyers had met their end, and we passed quite close to one beached or burning wreck after another. When the battle was over, Captain Crutchley jutted his beard out, removed his pipe from his mouth, and said to Admiral Whitworth, "Just like shelling peas, sir."
So, I mean, this battle was pretty much over before it began, but now it is finally over. Whitworth sends a report to London, but he's not able to land any troops as he's not sure how many German troops are in Narvik, and they're all dug in, and he's only got the Marines that he's got on his warships. So it's not, and even if they do land them, would they be able to support them with logistics? The 24th Brigade is on its way to land at Harsted nearby, so they decide it's best not to land. The German mountain troops, however, are now also reinforced by lots of damp German sailors who don't have warships. And this is good in one way because they're extra troops, but it does mean you've got 2,100 extra mouths to feed. They're also now cut off from their supplies they're not getting any supplies in from the sea. They can't escape. They're many miles from friendly troops, and the only supplies they can get are going to be through neutral Sweden if they can get hold of it. So for the Germans in Narvik, it is looking very, very bleak. And if you want to know more about what happens to these Germans and whether they get defeated, come back for episode 4. Thanks very much for listening to us, and really hope you've enjoyed this episode. And if you have enjoyed it, do hit the like, put any stars, whatever, depending on which platform you're listening to. Always very much appreciated, and comments. And if you want to support us, or we have bonus features, we have lots of bonus features coming, at least one for every episode, including photographs of Polish destroyers with clocks on the side, and then the reason why. Do head over to our Patreon, which we'll put the links in the show notes somewhere.